guys, so this is part 2 of a two-part series of things not to say to an adoptive parent. If you haven't seen part 1, we talked a lot about biological children and adoptive children and the adopted child's story and all sorts of other stuff. So if you haven't seen that one, check it out now. I'll put a link in the down bar. And here we go with part 2. The first thing I want to talk about in this part is it's going to be fine. People say this whenever they hear about an issue that someone is having with adoption, whether it's legal issues or a failed match, the HAPS thinking that birth mom is questioning her decision to place her child for adoption. I know whenever someone comes to anyone with a problem, the first thing we want to do is reassure them that their problem is going to be fine, that things are going to work out for them. The thing with adoption is everything is so uncertain. No one knows if it's going to be fine. No one, at least not with that match, or with those legal issues. You don't know if something is literally going to disrupt your adoption, and you will not be taking that child home. So by saying, oh, it's going to be fine, you're basically dismissing that uncertainty and giving a general platitude to try to make them feel better, but it never makes anyone feel better. Because in the long run, even if that match doesn't happen, things might be fine in a couple months or a couple years or a couple weeks. No one knows. They might bring home a different baby. But that match does need to be mourned if it doesn't happen. Again, this is akin to a woman coming to you and telling you she had a miscarriage, and you saying, oh, it's going to be fine. Like, you wouldn't do that then. A failed match is mourned just as much as a miscarriage. The HAPs know if the birth mom decided to parent that she made the choice that she felt was right for that child, and that child is going to do well with that family staying intact, and that is going to save them from trauma. But it doesn't change the fact that the HAPs were hoping to be parents and that they are not now. And so it's a difficult mourning process, just like it's a difficult process to bring home a baby that you have adopted and know that you're happy to be parents and you're happy that that child has been entrusted to you, but that that child is suffering trauma because of that separation from its birth mother, and that birth mother is suffering because she has given up a piece of her heart. So, again, reiterating for the 10 billionth time on this channel already, that adoption causes trauma, and it is a very difficult maze of emotions to navigate. The next one is, will they look like you? HAPs, on their adoption journey, choose specific things that they will accept in a match. And this is everything, and I'll do a different video on this again in the future, but this is everything from gender to age to disabilities and health issues to race to whatever else. Typically, most HAPs are not choosing specifically to have a child that looks like them only. Some do, and again, we'll talk about that in a future video, but most of the time they are focused on narrowing those options to children that they will be the best fit for. For example, if they live in a small town and they don't have a wide variety of specialist doctors, they may choose to not accept matches with certain disabilities because they know that they could not provide appropriate care easily for that child, and they want that child to be in the best environment and in the best fit for them. Or a family that is white may not accept a match from certain other races because they don't feel that they could provide the cultural education that that child would need to fully embrace their cultural identity. If they live in a small town that doesn't have a large Hispanic community, for example, they may not choose to accept a match with a child who is Hispanic because they cannot allow that child to easily explore their cultural identity. Typically, they're not worried about the child matching their family. They're not worried about the child looking like them. It does sometimes create a little bit more of an issue with bullying for the child if they don't look like the parents. It might create an issue when they're out in public and there are people who are not educated about adoption and say mean and hurtful things. But typically, it's not a real concern. We know now it's best for the child to be raised knowing that they are knowing that they are adopted, and to be able to have a free dialogue about adoption that is age appropriate. So it's not a secret anymore. So it's not something they'll find out just because they don't look like mom and dad. Wondering if the adopted child will look like the parents isn't really a concern for anyone. So it's not really isn't typically a concern for anyone, so it's not really a question that even needs to be asked. So along those same lines was, did you get to pick out your baby at the baby store? Again, we went over how they pick matches that will best suit them. And while some cases of adoption, people do go through profiles of waiting children that are legally free and pick children that they feel that they can best provide for, which is closer to what people think when they think picking out a baby. But even then, it's not shopping. It goes back to what we talked about in part one with you're not buying a baby. There is no baby store. That's trivializing the entire process of adoption. The next one is, so do they have any issues? I don't know why that would be anyone else's business other than the adoptive family and medical professionals. But a lot of people feel like it's their right to ask. And because they have heard that, adoptees typically go through trauma, which they do, and that they'll have mental health issues or things like that, or that a lot of adoptees are dealing with more medical issues because of lack of prenatal care or exposure in utero to substances. But it's not anyone's business unless you are caring for that child in some way. And it's very insensitive to ask someone to provide that information. The next one is, so where are their real parents? Again, adoptive parents are real parents. Their adopted children are their children. The only reason I use the qualifier adopted children in front of children is because it's for clarity on this channel. Most parents, when speaking about their actual child, will not say, that's my adopted child. They'll say, that's my child, because that child is theirs. They are caring for that child every day. They are providing for them. They are nurturing them. They're helping them work through the trauma of adoption. They are their parents. Biology is not the only way to create a family, and it does not legitimize a family. And on the flip side, a family that is not biologically related is not illegitimate. Are you afraid they'll want to see their real parents one day? Again, real parents. The term is biological or birth or first parents. As I said before, open adoptions are becoming more and more the norm because it is best for the child to have that link to their parent, to their biological parents, to know where they came from, to be able to get their medical history, to be able to have a relationship with them, and be able to see themselves in their biological parents. And so in most adoptions now, open adoption, or at least some form of open adoption, whether it's semi-open or whatnot, is typically what is strived for. So there isn't typically a fear that they're going to want to meet their biological parents one day. And HAPs and adoptive parents sometimes go into adoption with a little bit of fear of that openness, for a variety of reasons. But when you start the adoption process, you really have to examine where that fear is coming from and figure out how to work through that, because, again, we're all in this for the child, for what's best for the child. And we do what we have to do. We get over our own insecurities, and we work toward that goal. I could never do an open adoption. That's the next one. If you could never do an open adoption, I would encourage you to really examine why, like I just said. And if you really do find that there is no way you could be comfortable with your child seeing their biological parents at any point ever or knowing about them, then I would probably say to really question why you want to adopt, because it might not be a fit for your family if that is your situation and you are firm in the fact that you could never do an open adoption. Obviously, if you're not planning to adopt, then there's no real reason to say that at all because it's irrelevant to the HAP situation. We adopted our dog too. So the terminology for fostering and adopting pets is the same as with fostering children and adopting children. That doesn't make it the same process. It doesn't make it the same at all. And again, it kind of trivializes the whole process. It's received the same in the adoption world as it is the wider parenting world, where if someone says, oh, I have a son, someone says, oh, I have a fur baby at home. Like, that's sweet. You love your dog or your cat, and that's awesome. And no one is, trivializing that love, but the love for a pet is very different than the love for a child. And lumping them together like that is not really comparable. The next one is, when I had my kid, and this goes from everything for advice for the hospital stay, to nesting, to coming home and parenting, and everything in between. Everyone with all parents is eager to give advice about what they did that worked for their kid. For example, how to get them to sleep through the night. Some parents will tell you all about how sleep training is the only way to go. And the issue here is not that you're trying to be helpful by offering advice. That's not the problem at all. But you need to realize that your advice may not be applicable to a situation where adoption is involved. For example, we'll go with sleep training since I just brought it up. A lot of adoptive parents are going more toward attachment parenting to create that bond, to develop that bond with a child that they did not carry, or to create a bond with a child that has trouble creating bonds with people because they have experienced trauma or they've been uprooted several times throughout their life. Things like sleep training are counterproductive to attachment parenting, so that might not work with their situation. As I said in a previous video, a lot of the adoption process is vastly different than if someone were to be pregnant and to deliver a child. A lot of advice about the hospital and how to feed your baby, when to have a baby shower and how to have a baby shower, and the nesting process will be very different. It's going to happen at different times. It's going to happen in different ways. It's going to look very different than if someone were to have a biological child. So while your intentions are great to give advice to new parents, and they might appreciate the thought behind it, know that the advice might not work for them, and don't get offended if not every piece of advice you give them is something that they take to heart and actually use. Or if they say, well, that's great advice, but it's not really going to work for us, don't keep insisting that it's the only way to do things. The next one is, don't you want them to feel normal? And this usually goes along with like telling your child they're adopted, which, as I said, is recommended now to begin doing at an early age and keep it age appropriate. Just keep adding details, continue their story, and as they grow and are able to understand more as they mature emotionally. I think the word normal is problematic in a lot of situations, and this is one of them, because it creates an other. If you're not normal, you're abnormal. And so it's implying that they are already not normal. While it isn't the, typical way to create a family, it doesn't need to be stigmatized in that way. I know there are issues with bullying, but regardless of a child situation, there are going to be issues with bullying, no matter what. kids will find a reason to bully a child. And having them take ownership of their story and know how they came to that family, and know that adoption is something that can easily be talked about and discussed, and again, normalizing it so that it is something that no one is afraid to talk about in your family. You are giving them the confidence to be able to deal with that bullying if it happens. And that's kind of the view that a lot of HAPs and adoptive parents take. It's very similar to when I was growing up, and I was always, I wasn't always very confident, but in my family, it was normalized to talk about disability. I'm legally blind, for those of you that don't know. And so we talked about it. I took ownership of it. I was very independent. I did what I needed to do to succeed in the classroom visually, and I became my own advocate. So when I dealt with bullying because of my disability, it hurt, but it wasn't as devastating as it could have been if I had come from a home where, it was very hush-hush and it wasn't something we talked about. I think that was key, and a lot of HAPs take that same approach with adoption. Watch, you'll get pregnant now that you've adopted. That's the next one. There are a couple things wrong with this one too. Number one, who cares if they get pregnant now that they've adopted? They just have more children to love. And again, some people don't adopt because they cannot have biological children. They want to adopt. They want to have children in their home, and regardless of how they get there, it's easy to spread the love around. That doesn't matter. Again, this is separating adopted children, biological children, acting like you can't possibly love them the same, which isn't true. It also is insensitive because, as I said, a lot of HAPs choose adoption because they cannot have biological children. And pointing out the fact that, they've heard all these stories about people who adopted and then got pregnant isn't going to help if they know for a fact they cannot get pregnant. Someone brought this up on an adoption forum recently, and they were asking how people responded. And I said, what I've always wanted to say in this situation, because I've heard it a couple times since we started telling people we were adopting, I've always wanted to say, well, I doubt it, but if it happens, you'll definitely hear about it when I sue the surgeon that did my hysterectomy. So, again, whether or not they get pregnant doesn't matter, and it's not your business. The last one is, you're such good people to adopt. Regardless of why they've chosen to adopt, it doesn't make them any better people than someone who has a biological child. I know everyone has in their head this story that always goes with adoption, where the child was neglected or unwanted, or the parents died, and it would have been such a horrible life for them had they stayed with their biological parents. And that isn't always the case. And it perpetuates that savior complex that we talked about earlier in the series, where the adoptive parents are saving this child from a horrible life if they had stayed with their biological parents, when that isn't always the narrative, and that's definitely not how HAPs should or want to be portrayed. Things like, you're going to be great parents, are welcome, but you're such good people, or, oh, that's so wonderful that you're adopting. It may be wonderful, you may think it's wonderful that they're going to be parents, and that's fine to say. The line is, telling them they're great people just because they're adopting. That's kind of the ethical line there. Those are the majority of the things not to say to an adoptive parent that we have encountered. Like I said in the first part, most people that say these don't mean any harm. They're not meaning to be rude. They may not realize the personal boundaries and the ethical issues and everything else that goes into adoption. So if you've said some of these things to hopeful adoptive parents or people thinking about adoption, don't feel too bad if you just didn't know. It's really not a big deal. Most HAPs and adoptive parents that hear these things aren't automatically offended unless it's clear that you're saying them in a manner that is meant to be offensive. But yeah, this is just kind of the guide to how to navigate conversations about adoption with your friends and family who are adopting. So I will see you guys in future videos.